My aunt's shocking downfall after Grandma's hidden will exposed. My Aunt Carol, with that smug hyena's grin, was gloating as the lawyer read the will. 90% of everything, the voice echoed in the office, an echo of her victory, or so she thought. But my grandmother, Evelyn, even with Alzheimer's weaving a fog in her mind, never left loose ends. She was a woman of foresight, of just-in-cases, and her just-in-case came in a sealed envelope with a clause that promised to dynamite my aunt's charade. If anyone exerted undue pressure, if there was a trace of manipulation, the true beneficiary could open that envelope and unleash a storm of evidence of fraud. I opened that envelope. In less than 2 minutes, the fortune my aunt was already savoring turned to dust in her fingers. 5 months later, guess what? She was auctioning off her house, a villa that once represented her aspirations of grandeur, to pay the $200,000 she owed the insurance company. And me, I didn't do a single illegal thing. I just played by the rules my grandmother had set, and my aunt didn't even realize she was in the game. My grandmother, Evelyn. Ah, Evelyn. She wasn't your typical storybook grandmother, the kind who only knits and tells stories of old. Evelyn was a force of nature, a matriarch with a heart as big as her cunning. I grew up with the scent of her homemade tamales every Sunday, the rustle of the candies she always kept. Guess where? In her bra. It was her secret stash, her little act of rebellion. But beyond the sweets and the cooking, Evelyn had a sharp mind for business. When the stock market smelled of opportunity, she didn't buy bread, she bought stocks. And not just a few. Thanks to that vision and a life of hard work, her house on Olivo Street, a 1920s villa with a garden that looked like something out of a dream, was now worth $1.5 million. It was her legacy, her fortress. In our family, we were a trio of very different personalities. My mom, Sarah, Evelyn's older daughter, was the polar opposite of ambitious. She worked in a small bookstore, surrounded by stories and money, big numbers, left her quite cold. She was honest to the core, perhaps too trusting. Then there was Carol, my aunt, my mom's younger sister. Carol was a free spirit, or so she said. In reality, she was a kind of financial tornado, jumping from job to job, never putting down roots, always chasing the next big plan that never panned out. Her life was a series of near successes and a lot of debt. And me, David. I was always the observer, the analyst. I studied to be an insurance analyst, a career I chose to pay for college, but which led me to a specialization that, ironically, would become my secret weapon: fraud detection. I never imagined that my first big fraud case would be within my own family. Alzheimer's arrived stealthily, like a thief in the night, slowly stealing Evelyn's memories. At first, it was little things: the name of a flower in her beloved garden, an anecdote she would repeat. Then, the fog grew thicker. She began to forget her own daughter's names. It was heartbreaking to watch my grandmother's brilliant mind fade away. When the neurologist, in that deep, measured voice, diagnosed mild cognitive impairment, the family went into a kind of silent panic. Who would care for her? How would we protect her? That's when Carol, with a theatricality that I now see as the first act of her plan, offered herself. "I'm a widow, I have time," she said, with an expression of sacrifice that, at the time, seemed genuine to us. No one argued. My mom, always conflict-averse, sighed in relief. And I, trusting in the family bond, didn't see the trap. How naive we were. Carol's time quickly translated into control. In less than 6 months, Evelyn's house, which used to be a bustling family hub, became a fortress. The first victim of her purge was my mom, Sarah. Carol argued that my mom's presence stressed Evelyn. She needs peace, she needs quiet, she insisted, and my mom, with her gentle nature, withdrew. Then she canceled the night nurse, a sweet and competent woman who had been with Evelyn for years. Her excuse? She's too expensive, and Evelyn has me. Shortly after, Carol hired her own services, billing my grandmother's estate a whopping $150 an hour. $150 an hour to sit and watch TV while my grandmother slept, or to take her to the doctor. It was armed robbery, but wrapped in a cloak of family care. My access to Evelyn was drastically reduced, only on Sundays, and always with Carol as a shadow, monitoring every word, every glance. It was like a gilded cage. My grandmother, once so vibrant, now seemed smaller, more fragile, her eyes often lost in some distant memory. One Sunday, while Carol was distracted talking on the phone in another room, I went to take out the trash. And there, at the bottom of the bin, among food scraps and old papers, I found an envelope with the insurer's letterhead. I opened it with a pang of curiosity. "Reimbursement for Starlight Therapies," I read. Starlight Therapies? My brow furrowed. My job as an insurance analyst had taught me one thing: there is no such therapy. It was a made-up term, a blatant scam. I tucked the paper into my backpack, my heart pounding with a mix of indignation and a cold determination. That was the first thread, the one I started to pull. From that day on, every visit to Evelyn's house became a covert operation. I started to jot down every strange therapy name, every suspicious bill I saw by chance, every service Carol mentioned. The list grew. That month, just from the Starlight Therapies and other inventions, they totaled $8,400. an obscene amount for a woman who barely recognized her own reflection. It was then that I said to myself, with an icy certainty, this is just the beginning, and I'm not going to let her get away with it. The blood was beginning to boil in my veins, but I knew that revenge is a dish best served cold, and I was just starting to prepare the ingredients. Evelyn's illness progressed relentlessly until, 8 months after Carol had installed herself as her caregiver, my grandmother passed away. A heavy silence, filled with pain and, for me, a growing suspicion, hung over the family. Just 2 days after the funeral, before the grief had fully settled, we were all already at the notary's office. Carol, of course, was the first to arrive, wearing a new dress of a vibrant color that contrasted with the solemnity of the moment. Her nails, freshly painted a blood red, shone under the lamplight. It was an image that was seared into my memory, a macabre celebration. The lawyer, an older man with a monotone voice, opened the sealed envelope. The air in the room was thick with tension. And then, he read the words that sealed the fate of my grandmother and my family. I leave 90% of my assets and rights to my daughter Carolina for her selfless care and companionship during my final days. A blow. A punch straight to the gut. My mom beside me turned pale, her eyes filling with tears of disbelief and betrayal. I felt an icy chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to maintain my composure. I knew this couldn't be it. It couldn't be the end. We left the office in a stunned silence. Carol, however, couldn't contain her euphoria. In the car, while my mom sobbed quietly, she turned to us, her face bathed in tears of shameless happiness. Don't worry, she said, in a voice that was meant to be consoling but sounded hollow and triumphant. I'll be fair to you. Fair. The word burned. Her idea of justice became clear in less than a week. She bought herself a new, gleaming SUV with the money that had barely left my grandmother's coffers. Every time I saw her in that car, I felt that true justice had yet to arrive, and I, David, would make sure it did. That same afternoon, as the echo of the will reading still resounded in my head, my phone rang. It was the lawyer. David, could you come by for a moment? There's something your grandmother asked me to give you personally. My heart skipped a beat. A small, almost imperceptible spark of hope ignited in my chest. I returned to the office, this time with a mix of anticipation and caution. The lawyer, with a serious expression, handed me a smaller, also sealed envelope. Your grandmother was very specific, he explained. This envelope was only to be opened if someone contested the will or if there was a well-founded suspicion of fraud. She made me sign a confidentiality agreement, and you'll have to as well. Without hesitating, I signed the document, my name scrawled with a mix of haste and determination. I left there with the envelope under my arm, feeling its weight, its promise. It was like holding a time bomb. I locked myself in my apartment. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the wax seal. Inside, I found a small USB drive and a letter, written in my grandmother's elegant and somewhat shaky handwriting. I took a deep breath and began to read. If you are reading this, the letter began, it means my foresight was not in vain. It means someone manipulated me, took advantage of my weakness. Use your talent, son. I know you're good at what you do. I trust you to bring the truth to light. My grandmother's words hit me with the force of a lightning bolt. It wasn't just a request, it was a mission, a vote of confidence from beyond the grave. Tears blurred my vision, but they weren't of sadness, but of a contained fury and an adrenaline that coursed through every fiber of my being. With a lump in my throat, I connected the USB drive to my computer. 2 folders. The first, titled Medical Incapacity, and the second, Forensic Audit. My heart began to pound, a mix of fear for what I would find, and the thrill of a hunter about to find his prey. I knew that what I was about to discover wouldn't be easy, that I would probably unearth painful truths about my aunt's betrayal. But my grandmother's voice, that voice that reminded me of her faith in me, spurred me on. I wasn't trembling with fear, but with a pure electricity, the anticipation of the battle to come. Evelyn, my wise grandmother, had left one last masterstroke, and I was the one to execute it. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and days consumed by the investigation. My apartment transformed into an operations center, with documents scattered about, charts on the screen, and the constant hum of my computer. After my workday, I would dive into the hidden world my Aunt Carol had built. The first folder, Medical Incapacity, was a treasure trove of information. I opened my grandmother's medical reports, and what I found made my blood run cold. There were consents for treatments and financial decisions signed with a shaky handwriting that barely resembled Evelyn's. Most chillingly, the dates on those signatures coincided with periods when the neurologist himself had documented that my grandmother couldn't even tell the day of the week, much less the complexity of a legal document. It was clear manipulation of a vulnerable person. The reports were irrefutable proof that Evelyn did not have the cognitive capacity to make those decisions. Then, the forensic audit folder. My grandmother, with her characteristic shrewdness, had anticipated everything. I remembered that Carol had bought her a for emergencies cell phone, a gesture that seemed kind at the time. But Evelyn, in her intermittent lucidity, had activated automatic call recording, or, at least, had left on some system that captured the environment. I ran the old audio files from that phone through sound amplification software. What I heard turned my stomach. They weren't calls, but fragments of conversations, murmurs, the ambient sound of the house. And in the middle of that white noise, Carol's whispering voice, laden with a barely veiled cruelty. "If you don't sign this, Evelyn, I'll leave you alone. No one else will come to see you. You want to be left alone, don't you?" It was pure and simple emotional blackmail, recorded, indisputable. The manipulation wasn't just financial, but also psychological, preying on the loneliness and fear of a sick, elderly woman. But the fraud didn't end there. My specialty in insurance fraud detection became my most potent weapon. At night, I dove into Evelyn's insurer's database, cross-referencing information, searching for patterns. What I discovered was a web of deceit that left me speechless. I found 122 services billed in my grandmother's name on days when, according to her own medical records, Evelyn was hospitalized or in a rehabilitation center, unable to receive any therapy or care at home. From energetic massages to holistic nutritional consultations, they were phantom services, each with its corresponding inflated bill. The total amount of this fraud, with the insurer alone, came to $123,700. $123,700. My aunt hadn't just stolen the inheritance. She had plundered my grandmother's health funds, putting her real well-being at risk. I organized every report, every recording, every fake invoice into a digital dossier that I titled, with a mix of anger and hope, Project Justice. It was a massive volume of evidence, irrefutable, overwhelming. The exhaustion was immense, but the adrenaline kept me going. I wasn't just defending my grandmother's memory. I was fighting against greed, against abuse, against the idea that the most vulnerable could be exploited with impunity. And I, David, the insurance analyst, was ready to present my case. With the Project Justice dossier under my arm, I knew I couldn't go it alone. I needed a strategist, a legal gladiator. I hired a lawyer specializing in elder law, a woman with a piercing gaze and a formidable reputation. I presented the case to her, and her eyes lit up with a mixture of outrage and cold determination. Together, we filed a formal challenge to Evelyn's will, arguing cognitive incapacity and undue influence on the part of Carol. Not only that, we requested an emergency hearing from the judge to freeze the assets and prevent my aunt from continuing to squander what wasn't hers. Carol, of course, received the notice with her usual arrogance. "That piece of paper is worthless," she scoffed on the phone with my mom, convinced her victory was absolute. "They're just desperate gasps." She was wrong, and she was spectacularly wrong. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was thick with tension. Carol arrived with her lawyer, a man in an impeccable suit, but with an overconfident expression that would soon vanish. My mom and I were there, nervous but resolute. When our turn came, my lawyer was relentless. She didn't mince words. On the large screen in the room, the charts I had meticulously prepared began to be displayed. They were clear, concise timelines, showing spikes in service billings right after Evelyn's doctor had recommended not stressing the patient and keeping her in a calm environment. The contradiction was blatant, the visual evidence undeniable, but the coup de grace came with the audio files. The lawyer asked for permission to play a selection of recordings from Evelyn's cell phone. The silence in the room was sepulchral. When Carol's manipulative, whispering voice filled the space, threatening my grandmother with loneliness if she didn't sign, even the judge, a man accustomed to the coldness of facts, fell silent. His expression, previously impassive, contorted into a look of indignation. I could feel the eyes of everyone present fixed on Carol, who shrank in her seat, her face paling with every word, her red nails now looking like powerless claws. Her lawyer, his face ashen, asked for a 5-minute recess. The room emptied, leaving an echo of Carol's words. When they returned, my aunt's arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by obvious panic. Her lawyer, in a much less confident voice, made us an offer. "My client is willing to return $50,000 and give up a portion of the house if you drop the lawsuit." $50,000. A pittance compared to what she had stolen, a mockery of my grandmother's memory. My lawyer looked at me, waiting for my response. I shook my head. "We refuse," I said, my voice firm, without a hint of doubt. It wasn't about the money, it was about justice. It was for Evelyn. And my aunt, at that moment, knew her game was over. The judge's decision was decisive, a hammer blow that resonated with the force of truth. He not only annulled the fraudulent will, but also ordered the full repayment of all misappropriated funds, plus interest. But it didn't end there. Evelyn's insurance company, alerted by the evidence of massive fraud we had presented, opened a parallel criminal investigation against Carol. The noose was tightening. My aunt, facing the possibility of criminal charges and prison time, finally agreed to an out-of-court settlement. She agreed to pay a sum of $200,000 to avoid a longer, more humiliating criminal trial. The problem, of course, was that Carol had already spent most of my grandmother's money. The new SUV, the trips, the jewelry she shamelessly flaunted, it had all drained the coffers. The only way to make the payment was to sell her house, the same house she had inherited from her first marriage and which had been her refuge from the failures of her life. The auction was publicly announced. It was a strange, almost circus-like event. Neighborhood busybodies showed up, former neighbors came to watch the spectacle, and even my old 5th-grade teacher, who always had a keen eye for drama, was there. Carol was there, of course, her face gaunt, her eyes swollen with tears. Her once smug hyena smile had turned into a grimace of defeat. When the auctioneer's hammer came down for the last time, sealing the sale of her house, a groan escaped her lips. The buyer paid $950,000, a considerable sum. But after paying off the outstanding mortgage and fees, what was left was barely enough to cover the $200,000 she owed the insurer. She was left with practically nothing. The house that had been her status symbol was gone. Shortly after, I learned from a cousin that Carol had moved into a small, 40-square-meter rental apartment in a remote neighborhood. And most tellingly, she still had unpacked boxes. It was the portrait of a life on pause, of an uncertain future, of an ambition that had devoured her. My aunt's greed, which had once promised her wealth and power, had left her empty-handed. And I was just the messenger of my grandmother's justice. With the will annulled and the funds recovered, the judge ordered the legitimate distribution of Evelyn's estate. The fortune, which Carol had tried to plunder, was divided equally. 50% for my mom, Sarah, and 50% for me. It was an immense relief, not just because of the money, but for the vindication of my grandmother's memory. But the villa on Olivo Street, the house where Evelyn had cooked tamales and kept candies in her bra, the place where so much intrigue and pain had been brewed, no longer felt like a home. The memories, both happy and bitter, weighed too heavily within its walls. We decided to sell it. With a portion of the money, my mom and I embarked on a new mission, a legacy worthy of Evelyn. We founded Evelyn's House, a day center dedicated to seniors with Alzheimer's. It's not just a place, it's a promise. A place where real, evidence-based therapies are offered, not the fanciful starlight therapies my aunt had invented. It's a space of dignity, of genuine care, of support for families struggling with this cruel disease. It's Evelyn's way of continuing to help, of continuing to be a force for good. One day I got a call. It was from Carol. She had heard about the center. In a voice I barely recognized, she asked if there was an opening for a receptionist. The irony was brutal. The woman who had tried to steal everything was now looking for a job at the very place we had founded with what she had wanted to destroy. I told her no. I didn't hire her. But true to my own conviction that there is always a chance for change, I made her an offer. Carol, I said, if you ever provide evidence of other frauds, if you use your experience to help those who have been victimized, we will pay for an ethics course for you. Maybe you can still do something good with your life. She hasn't called back. I guess for her, ethics is too expensive a concept. If this story made you feel that justice, though sometimes slow, finally arrives to set things right, then subscribe. Every week, I uncover real cases of clean revenge, of how the truth always finds its way, even in the deepest shadows of human greed. What would have happened if I hadn't acted? My grandmother Evelyn used to say, with that ancestral wisdom that characterized her, money is like water. It slips away if you don't manage it. A simple phrase, but loaded with a profound truth about managing and protecting one's assets. If I hadn't opened that envelope, if I hadn't trusted her foresight, that wise warning would have come true in the worst way. Carol would have drained every last cent from Evelyn's estate, leaving nothing behind. The house, the money, everything would have vanished on her whims and debts. But the consequences would have gone far beyond our family. The insurance company, by not detecting the massive fraud Carol was perpetrating, would have continued to pay for phantom services. And who pays for those frauds? All of us. Premiums for honest customers would have gone up, and the system once again would have placed the burden of the dishonesty of a few on the shoulders of the innocent. Trust in institutions would have eroded even further, and most painfully, the memory of my grandmother, a woman of integrity, would have been sullied, her legacy of hard work and shrewdness erased by greed. The moral of this story, and of life itself, is clear. When you see a crack, don't wait for it to become a crater. When you feel that pang of doubt, that intuition that something isn't right, act. Because sometimes your action is the only barrier between innocence and exploitation, between justice and oblivion. Don't underestimate the power of a small act of vigilance. You don't need to be a fraud analyst like me to spot the signs of elder abuse. Often, the most attentive eye belongs to a family member, a neighbor, or a friend. The warning signs are clear, and being informed can make the difference between protecting a loved one and watching them be exploited. Pay attention to seats, sudden changes in a will, or legal documents. If an older person, especially one suffering from cognitive decline, changes their will overnight without a logical explanation and without the knowledge of other close family members, it's a giant red flag. It can be a sign of coercion or manipulation. Also, be alert from WISE, medical bills that no one understands, or unusual services. Do exotic therapies or bills for unused medical equipment suddenly appear? Is there a drastic increase in medical expenses without a clear justification? Investigate. Ask questions. Don't leave it in doubt. The isolation of the older adult is another critical sign. If a family member or caregiver begins to restrict visits from other relatives and friends, if the older person's phone goes unanswered, or if they are prevented from leaving the house, it is a common tactic used by abusers to control the victim and prevent them from asking for help or revealing what is happening. Finally, watch for spending that doesn't match their lifestyle or income. If the older person or their caregiver suddenly starts living beyond their means with extravagant purchases, luxurious trips, or new properties, and there is no clear source of income to justify it, it is very likely they are using the older person's money. What can you do? Be proactive. Keep copies of your loved one's bank and credit card statements if you have access and trust. Document any suspicious conversations. If it's legal in your country, record calls or conversations that seem dubious, always informing yourself about local laws on the matter, and at the slightest doubt, do not hesitate to call the local elder abuse hotline or social services. They have the resources and experience to investigate. Your action, your vigilance, may be the only wall between unbridled greed and the person who, perhaps, once fed you, cared for you, and loved you. Don't leave them alone. Tell me in the comments. Do you know someone who has been a victim of insurance fraud or financial elder abuse? What would you do if a family member suddenly changed a will suspiciously? I'd love to read the craziest, most heartbreaking stories in the next video. Your experience can help others,